Hi folks, welcome to a wrap up of what I think was a pretty good month's reading from a science fiction point of view in September this year. As usual, I'll be going through them in the order that I read them, and I'll be ranking them mercilessly as we go. The first book that I read this month was Tomorrow by Beckett, and this is a book written by an author about an author failing to write a book. It's a little bit recursive in that fashion. We're on a fictional island continent which has distinct South American vibes, but also some Anglo names, and the waiters and waitresses are all blonde-haired with blue eyes, which is a bit backwards. And I couldn't help but spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out where the hell we were, and had an inkling that we might not even be on Earth, although there aren't any direct hints for that. Our protagonist is a procrastinator. He wants to write a book, and he has a very specific book in mind. It will have no beginning, middle and end. He wants to tell the whole story at once, and the analogy that this prospective author uses is he wants it to be like a cathedral window, a stained glass window, which has sections and parts, but you have to see the whole thing together to see the whole story. And then Beckett promptly steals that idea and uses it for the structure for this book, the one that I'm reading tomorrow. And it's therefore a patchwork jumble of a book. It's out of sequence. There might be a 2 or 3 page section of the protagonist as a younger man living in a student flat. Then there'll be another 2 or 3 page section of him as a captive in a cave in the jungle. And then there'll be another one of him being a recluse in his hut trying to write this damn book, and then fast forward to his later years, or even his infirm old age, and it jumps about from one to the other in no particular order. I actually wondered aloud as I was reading it exactly how Beckett wrote this. Did he write it in linear fashion from start to finish and then break it up into small little chunks and then jumble them up, or did he write them in the sequence that they appear in the book? And he revealed, when I spoke to him a few weeks back, they actually wrote it as it came out on the page, and he had no plan in mind. He was just like writing, and it came out of him in about 6 weeks, which for him is record-breaking speed for a novel. And I couldn't decide as I was reading it if it was a clever structure or if it was a bit of a distraction or even an annoyance. And it might have been in the hands of a weaker author, but I think Beckett's prose is strong enough to hold my attention. And Tomorrow has a lot to say, but I think we could say that it says it quietly. Is Tomorrow science fiction? Not overtly. It's certainly experimental in its structure in the best traditions of the new wave. The location doesn't exist, so it's speculative from that point of view. It's possible, as I say, that we're not even on Earth. There are pterosaurs in the jungle and naiads swimming in the river, for example. So yes, despite its superficially quotidian everyday material, I think Tomorrow is most definitely science fiction. I think Tomorrow was a little bit out of my comfort zone. It's not in my science fiction wheelhouse, as it were, but I went along for the ride and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I give Tomorrow by Beckett 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. In a complete change of scene, next I read Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson, and this was a chewy book. It was a bit of a mouthful. It took me longer to read than I thought it would. I thought I would blow through it in a couple of days, and it took me more like a week. I enjoyed it, but I never got into a good flow with it. This is cyberpunky with added ancient history. There are 2 chief protagonists, and they're both very fun. One is a pizza delivery guy, and his name is actually Hero Protagonist, and he is a top-notch hacker on the side. And then there's a sassy teenage skateboard courier called YT. It is ostensibly a cyberpunk novel, and those elements were interesting. And I also like the jumbled vision of a future society that Stephenson presents. The mafia are now a respectable employer, for example. The US government runs an ever-shrinking area of what used to be the USA, and what was formerly the USA is now mostly a patchwork of micro-states, franchises and burbclaves. And there's lots packed into this book, lots to like. There are metaverses, there are avatars, and ancient Sumerian conspiracies of all things, speaking in tongues even, and ultimately a megalomaniacal bid for unquestioned authoritarian control of the whole planet. Hero has samurai swords and knows how to use them in both the virtual and the actual world, with bloody results. Snow Crash is breathless stuff. There is a lot of info dumping. Stephenson makes use of a virtual librarian who vomits forth more than you ever wanted to know about Sumerian gods and the echoes that has down history and in the gods of other religions that followed. I found that a little bit too much. Some of it was interesting, but then it just got a bit boring for me, frankly. So I think this is probably my first cyberpunk novel. I really feel like I need to go back and read Gibson's Neuromancer and 1 or 2 other cyberpunk novels to see where Snow Crash sits in the subgenre, if you like. But I think it was a pretty good introduction. I give Snow Crash 7 out of 10, a planetary pleasure. In another sort of whiplash change of scene. Next, I read The Genocides by Thomas M. Disch, and this was a mercifully quick read. It's bleak. It's an alien invasion story, kind of. It's more like an alien farming takeover, really. We don't see any aliens as such, but Disch kind of gives us some hints off stage a little bit that this is an oft repeated mundane exercise for the aliens of the piece. They've planted seeds on Earth and those grow into enormous tree type things and are ultimately harvested by the aliens for purposes we don't understand. And Earth as we know it is subsumed by these plants, capital P. And at the beginning of the book, we're introduced to a small community eking out a hard scrabble existence in a village somewhere near the Great Lakes. They've planted some corn, and the alien plants, capital P, have been weeded out and held back to allow some harvest to take place. And they're even making some use of the alien plants for everyday items like baskets and so on. Life is tough, and then it gets tougher. Their cows, or nearly all of their cows, and one child is incinerated, and there's more incinerating to follow until the remaining population, a couple of dozen, are forced underground. And added to this lethal mix are some desperate humans, some bent on power and control, some on revenge, some on love, and some on all of the above. It is all rather desperate and bleak, and it ends in a very poignant reflection of the biblical Adam and Eve story. I do like an end of the world tale, and although that it's bleak, the writing is excellent, it's sparse, it's taut, the characters are sufficiently well drawn for what is quite a short book, and I will definitely be back for more Thomas M. Disch. I give The Genocides 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next was War of the Maps by Paul McAuley, my second Paul McAuley book. This is set on an artificial planet that has also an artificial sun. And disappointingly, there are no maps in this book. I was hoping for maps, but there are no maps. I was forced, therefore, to rely on Paul McAuley's world building, which fortunately for me is pretty good. But there are maps in the book. Geographically speaking, of course, each of the territories is referred to as a map. The islands or the continents or the countries or whatever are referred to as maps. But there are also maps, genetically speaking, and this is where most of the action takes place. There are map readers in this world. They have the ability to see and analyse the genetic makeup of a creature or plant, just one of a number of different gifts that are possessed by the people on the planet. Our protagonist, for example, has the gift of suppressing other people's gifts. And there's another guy who has electricity in his fingers and can give you a personal cattle prod. He can give you an electric shock. There is an invasion on this artificial world, a strange genetic invasion. We don't know if it's a pathogen, some kind of organism, or if there's some driving intelligence behind it. There's a wave of rapid modifications to the genetic map of all living things in its path. It's Life Gym, but not as we know it. The protagonist is nameless. He's the Lucidor, a kind of cop. He's retired, but he has unfinished business. He needs to track down a bad guy, Renfrey Hay, who has done a runner to a neighbouring map. Armed only with his stout staff, he definitely gives off vibes of Clint Eastwood's The Man with No Name, or maybe Stephen King's The Gunslinger from the Dark Tower. The world building in this book is pretty good. I think it may be even great. We're on a Dyson sphere, it turns out, a smallish one. And the human population, has been there for a long time, centuries or maybe even millennia. And the origins of the world, where it came from, who built it, who put the solar mirrors in orbit, are kind of lost to myth and legend, and people are just getting on with their lives. It's the stuff of gods, really. The technology level is a strange mix of agrarian 19th century, but with frequent mentions of higher technology, things like lasers, blasters, plastic money, electric cars. And there are distinct vibes of Ian M. Banks, maybe from Matter or perhaps inversions. I liked the lead character, the Lucidor, and some of the people that he meets along the way. And I think that McAuley does a great job describing the world and the life there, especially the altered life, which is left in the aftermath of the genetic alterations. And we're left with enough ambiguity about the history, about the deep past, to tease and to make me wonder what the backstory really is. I'm pleased to have read War of the Maps, and now I'm impatient to read some more of his books, many of which I have on my shelves. I give War of the Maps a solid 8 out of 10, a stellar splendour. Next came Solaris by the great Stanislaw Lem, and I have mixed feelings. We are in orbit above Solaris on a space station of sorts. It's pretty big, a kilometre or two across, and despite that, it seems to be able to ascend and descend at will to within a few metres even of the surface if necessary. Humanity has been studying Solaris for decades. There's a huge body of academic work, and I know that because we have to read a significant chunk of the bloody stuff as part of this book. The protagonist is Kelvin, and he's recently arrived back on the station, and things are not as they should be. You can tell that something weird is going on, but we're not sure what. He gets a bit of a surprise when he goes to his quarters and finds that there's an African tribal woman there in a grass skirt and a straw hat, not much else. Who the hell is she? How does she get to Solaris? And why on earth is she in his room? Then to add to the mystery, his next visitor is his long dead wife, and she doesn't know anything, how she came to be there or why she's there or how can she be alive again. But she knows Kelvin and she cannot bear to be separated by him. Strange stuff is happening to his two colleagues on the station too. And Stanislaw Lem does a good job of building a sense of claustrophobic weirdness. And that's the part of this book that I really, really enjoyed. The scientists are busy theorising, trying their best to ignore their visitors with a capital V. Are they a manifestation of the strange ocean? Is it some kind of attack? Or is it merely a futile attempt at communication? The atmosphere gets more and more claustrophobic and intense as the book progresses. A little bit like Snow Crash, there's a lot of info dumping. In fact, it's worse than info dumping. There's an academic library on the station, and Kelvin goes to the academic library frequently to read and summarise academic papers, and they are listed in exhaustive detail for pages and pages and pages in the book. And the first one I powered through, but after that I really skimmed, or in some cases even skipped them. For me, those added really nothing much to the story, and I found them very tedious indeed. So for me then, Solaris has a split personality. It's the sweaty parts, the intense parts, the claustrophobic, the weird, the inscrutably alien parts, the parts highlighting the impossibility of communicating with an alien entity that just operates on an entirely different basis to us boring old monkeys. That part I really liked, and I would happily have read more of that. The tedious academic info dumps, not so much, not for me at all. So with the info dumpy sections weighing it down, unfortunately, I'm obliged to give Solaris a 6 out of 10 for me, a nebulous narrative. Next was An Old Friend, Revelation Space, which I read on audiobook. It's a reread for me, and I was very happy to be back in this world. There are 3 plot threads in this book, separate to start with, but converging as the book progresses to its revelatory climax. The first thread opens with an archaeological dig on Resurgam, a recent colony world that was previously home to an alien civilization, the Amarantin, who are long dead in some catastrophic event or other. Dan Sylvester, one of our protagonists, is the archaeologist obsessed with understanding what's happened to them, concerned with what it might mean for humanity. In the second thread, we're introduced to the Ultras, who live in the interstellar deep, and they to and fro between stars on kilometres-long light-hugger starships, spending quite a lot of the time in reefer-sleep, whilst they travel decades or even centuries past in the outside world. The Ultras are a delightfully cheery bunch, and they are looking for Sylvester to help their captain, who is suffering from the melding plague, which is gradually merging his body with the technology in the ship. And our third thread follows Anna Curie, who's an ex-soldier turned paid assassin, commissioned by the mysterious Mademoiselle. We don't really know who she is until later in the book, to kill Sylvester, and we don't know why either. Reynolds is a big fan of plausible technology. In his books, there's no convenient faster-than-light travel for him, which means that the journey times are realistic. Even approaching the speed of light, they take a long time. And as a result, the plot jumps around for years at a time, backwards, forwards, backwards again, and that's necessary so that the plot threads, which start separately, can converge in one place and one time later on in the book. I enjoyed being back in this world. Reynolds does a great job, I think, introducing us to this future, and there are hints of other planets, other relics, other human factions, which we meet in greater detail in the books that follow. I really like the baroque and aloof Ultras and their strange existence, and Captain Brannigan's melding plague affliction is wonderfully gruesome. The nostalgia for Infinity, the Ultras ship in this book, is just cool, and Reynolds does a great job conveying its sheer size. And my big takeaway is that I really need to read the others that follow now. I give the justly renowned Revelation Space 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next, I read a more recent book, Pluto Shine by Lucy Kissick. In Pluto Shine, we're in a future solar system. It's uncertain how far in the future, but by this point, humanity has colonised several planets in the solar system and terraformed them to a degree. Lucius, our protagonist, is a terraformer, a sunbringer specifically, and he is tasked with building an enormous parabolic mirror with the intention of reflecting the energy and light of the very distant sun onto Pluto's surface. There's already a small scientific station based on Pluto. There are 100 or so scientists and their families, and that's pretty well established. Nu, our other main character, is a 10 or 11-year-old girl, and she's the daughter of the founder of the colony, and she, at the time we meet her, is a selective mute. She does not speak. There's some trauma in the past, which is hinted at in the book, that's caused this, and more of that is revealed as the story goes along, and it involves her and her family. Lucius and Nu are an unlikely partnership, and they hit it off from the beginning, and it's quite a touching, heartwarming friendship, and that element of the plot really worked for me. It's a little bit like there's a sort of found family vibe. It reminded me a little bit of the Becky Chambers books. And so if you like the Becky Chambers books, then I definitely recommend giving Pluto Shine a go. But it's not all soft and fluffy. Should Pluto be terraformed at all? Someone is hacking in the Pluto Shine project with plenty of ensuing peril. The terraforming process, after all, involves a giant magnifying glass, and they intend to bung 3 asteroids at the planet. But who is the saboteur and why exactly are they doing it? There's also the potential for life on Pluto despite its extreme conditions. And all of those threads converge to a heady climax to the book. I very much enjoyed my time in this book. I didn't want to put it down and ended up having a late night so that I could finish it. And Pluto Shine is Lucy Kissick's first and so far only book, although I gather that she's working on another. I give Pluto Shine 7 out of 10. It was a planetary pleasure. Next came The Forge of God by Greg Bear, which is a first contact tale with added disaster. The book opens in Death Valley, and there are 3 geologists on a field trip, and they come across a feature that should not be there. It doesn't appear on any of their geological survey maps. It's not on any of the satellite images. It's kind of like a volcano cone, and that would be odd enough. But the geologists, being geologists, go for a bit of an explore, and they find near what appears to be an entrance to this mound what can only be described as an alien. This alien, who's got a bit of sunstroke and dehydration, says in a croaky voice, "I'm afraid there's bad news," or something very much like that. There's a mirror image feature in the Australian desert, and there they've got a very different message indeed. Their messengers are robots, and those robots are offering them all kinds of goodies, technological advancements, cures for cancer, you name it. And the Australian government naturally is very positive about the whole thing. But which is it to be, and why are we getting conflicting messages? Our main character, Arthur Gordon, is a scientist. He's a former science advisor to the president, and he's got an inside track to some contacts at NASA, and he gets a phone call one day telling him that Europa, Jupiter's 4th moon, has vanished, and that's never going to be a good sign, is it? We've got some berserker type action. There are von Neumann machines, both good and ill. The president, it turns out, is a bit weak-willed. He gets religion as a result of the revelations. He's working on the basis that this is the wrath of God, and humanity's brought it upon itself, and all it can do is suck it up and take the punishment. And some people are quite happy to go along with that, and then others aren't. Others, of course, believe that humanity should be doing what it could to beat this alien menace and to save itself. Fortunately for humanity, we have some help. There are some of those Van Neumann machines in the form of a kind of self-replicating spider are on our side, and they are busy going about their inscrutable business trying to get us set up for an escape from the impending doom. I did like that sense of impending doom and the relative helplessness of the humans. I thought that the pacing in Forge of God was good. The story moved along pretty well. I listened to it on audiobook, and I thought the narrator did a good job. The spiders were cool, and I thought that the glimpse of the future that we get at the very end of the book were intriguing, and certainly enough to tempt me into reading the sequel, The Anvil of Stars. I give The Forge of God 8 out of 10. It's an exploding stellar splendour. Before we go on to my last book of the month, I did also make a start on Gene Wolfe's The Islands of Dr. Death and Other Stories, but I only read about a third of it, and so I'm not counting that as one of this month's reads. I'll pick it up at some point, and when I finish it, I'll include it. The final book that I read then in September was The Empire of Fear by Brian Stableford. This is a vampire tale, unusually for me. We're in the 1620s at the beginning of the book in something called Grand Normandy, which it turns out is what we know as Great Britain, and which has been subsumed as part of a greater Normandy following the Norman invasion of 1066. So we find out pretty quickly that history has run different here. The aristocracy are vampires. They're very long-lived, and they don't really feel pain. Favoured humans can be elevated to the vampire ranks, and that's a method of control and encouragement. But of course, there's a resistance, and it is concealed and hidden. What they're trying to figure out is what is the source of the vampire power? How exactly are vampires made? And what would happen if anyone could be made a vampire? This quest for answers takes them ultimately to Africa. There's a difficult journey to the interior, a lot of literal mumbo jumbo. And for me, the Africa section was overlong and a bit boring. And I was impatient to get back to a familiar and yet unfamiliar Europe, but I enjoyed those sections of the book much more. I do like an alternate history tale, and there was a decent chunk of that in Empire of Fear, albeit jumbled around a little bit. There are various historical figures who are out of place due to being long-lived vampires. Richard the Lionheart features in this book, for example, several hundred years after he died. There's also Vlad the Impaler. There's a vampire Borgia Pope. And as I said, I really enjoyed the European parts, particularly the first 2 sections. I do think that it was let down by the overlong middle section, so I give Empire of Fear 6 out of 10, a nebulous narrative. And all of that leaves me with something of a dilemma. None of the books blew my socks off. There's no 9s or 10s, but there are 5 sat at a very respectable 8 out of 10 at Stellar Splendor. Revelation Space and Forge of God were both great, but perhaps more straight up science fiction, and thus perhaps 2 obvious choices. And of the other 3, I think it's between Tomorrow and the Genocides. They're both extremely different books, both stylistically and from a content point of view. I enjoyed different aspects of those 2 books, and on reflection, I think my book of the month must go to The Genocides by Thomas M. Disch. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye for now.